Jingiwala, good evening. I'm Melissa Lukashenko. I've recently joined the board of the Australian Society of Authors, and on behalf of the ASA, I'd like to welcome you to the 2020 Colin Simpson Memorial Lecture. The ASA acknowledges the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. We acknowledge their ongoing connections to land, sea, and community, and pay our respects to all elders past, present, and emerging. We extend that respect to all First Nations people who might be joining us this evening. I'd like to thank you for joining us for this annual lecture, which commemorates the journalist and author Colin Simpson, a founding member of the ASA, the driving force behind the introduction of public lending right in 1975, and an accomplished travel writer and television host. An illustrious range of industry luminaries has delivered this lecture, and this evening we are delighted to be hearing from award-winning author, activist, historian and essayist Tony Birch. Tony will speak tonight on the power of writing and reading and how a writer is made, focusing on 5 influential moments in his life and the relationships that drove his passion for reading and, eventually, writing. We will enter the silence of the local library of his childhood, meet a character from a seminal novel of his teenage reading years, and visit the kitchen tables that produced influential writing from Aboriginal women. His desire is to pay respect to institutions, to individuals, and to the brief moments of generosity that create a need in a budding author to tell stories. It's my honour to hand over to my friend, the brilliant Uncle Tony Birch.
Hi, I'm Tony Birch, and I'm really privileged to give the Simpson Lecture this year for the Australian Society of Authors. As you'll note that I'm actually sitting down, so it'll be more of a conversation this year. We're in very peculiar circumstances, so we can't gather together, so the event is being filmed. So I'd like to think maybe that this year it's more of a fireside chat than it is any lecture. Before I start and give you a sense of what we're going to do tonight, I want to make a formal acknowledgement of country. So that tonight we're here in St Kilda at Reading's Bookshop, and of course we're on the land of the Bunurong Nation, and therefore I want to pay my respects to Bunurong people, Bunurong elders past and present and emerging, and to recognise the fact that we're on Bunurong land that has never been ceded to any colonial authority, and it's a privilege to speak here tonight. What we're going to do over the course of the next 35 or 40 minutes is that I'm going to take you on something of a journey which is about my own, I suppose, reading and writing experience. I have a very particular and peculiar relationship with writing and reading, and I want to give you a sense of what I regard as the real power of language, the power of words, and how it's held me in good stead throughout my life. So I'm going to do this through a series of memoir events, starting from childhood and finishing with where I'm at today with my writing. And I hope that what I have to say really encourages you as authors to continue of work, and of course encourages all of us to be lifelong readers, which is of course essential to anyone who wants to enjoy the process of being a published writer. So I grew up in the inner city of Melbourne, as many people will know, and I grew up in a very impoverished era in the inner city of Melbourne. So I was born in Carlton, but I moved to the suburb of Fitzroy when I was very young. And I remember when I launched my first book, Shadowboxing, which I'll talk about later on tonight, I said at the introduction to that launch, which was held, by the way, at the Fitzroy Reading Room, the old Fitzroy Library, I said that in our house we never had any books and we couldn't afford to have books. And after the event, my older sister Deborah came up to me and said, the reason we didn't have any books is because our father actually chopped up the bookcase that we had and used it for firewood. We did actually have a few books until the demise of the bookcase. Whether we did or not, I can't remember. But what I can remember so vividly from those early childhood years is what became my introduction to the public library. And my introduction to the public library from when I was about of the age of 5 or 6, I would say was the beginning of me understanding how much I loved literature and how much I loved and thought about being a writer. So the Fitzroy Library is located in the old Fitzroy Town Hall. It was a very foreboding place to enter. It was one of those classic libraries of the period where total silence was the norm, and the librarian looked over the library from a very high desk and looked at everyone who came into the library with a fairly deep frown. So I'd say it was a very intimidating place. But I was attracted to the library, I think, one, because of that silence, and two, because of the quietness and order of the library, so that my own home life was a chaotic experience in many ways, and to enter the library was to go into a place that was completely ordered, completely quiet, and somewhere very different for me as a child. So I started to go into the Fitzroy Library after school, and I found that my curiosity was matched eventually by the curiosity of the librarian, who one day asked me what I was doing in the library and why was I coming to the library every afternoon. And I didn't have an adequate explanation for him, except that I loved being in the space. And he said to me then, "Do you want to borrow a book?" And I wasn't sure what he meant. And I asked, "What do you mean borrow a book?" He said, "Well, you can choose a book that you like, and you can take that book home, and when you're finished with that book, you can bring it back to the library and get another book." He then took me to the front of the library, to the desk, the infamous desk, and he produced a library card, a blank library card, and filled in my details on that card, stamped that card, and then said to me, "Go and choose a book that you want to read and take that book home." He directed me to the children's section of the library, and I rifled through many, many books, and I sat on the floor going through books. I can't remember today which books I chose, but I remember picking up 2 books and taking them back to the librarian's desk. He stamped a date of return in those books and then said to me, "We'll see you when you come back." I actually hesitated at that moment because it seemed astounding to me that a person would let me take a book out of a room without having paid for it and be assured that I would bring that book back to the library. Of course, I did take the books home. Of course, I did read the books. And yes, of course, I did bring them back to the library. And I became an avid library attendant from that day. I still have my public library card. And it was one of the first and most foremost experiences of my life to become a member of a library. My schooling became really disrupted from about the age of 12. And one of the things that continued was reading, but it was in a sense the only thing that continued in relationship to my, what you might call my academic learning. So that I became a very poor student generally. I did very poorly at school, and eventually I was actually expelled from 2 high schools in Melbourne, both in the same year, in the beginning of Form 4. But something happened to me again, which was extremely formative during my high school years, during my early high school years. And what happened to me is that I was introduced to a book. The book is a very famous book, which I have here with me. It's Barry Hines' book, Kestrel for a Knave. And we were set this book as a set text in Form 2 when I was at Richmond High School. Now, if people don't know the novel is about a young boy, Billy Casper. He lives in a northern city in northern England. It's a very industrial city. It's a very grimy city, a very strong working class city, which is dependent on the coal industry for its survival. What I learnt about reading this book is that Billy Casper, although he was on the other side of the planet, many of the experiences that he went through during his day, during his life, were experiences that were not only common to me, but were very common to many of the kids that I went to high school with. And I would say that those kids too recognised something of themselves in Billy Casper. So Billy Casper lives in a fairly violent environment. The novel starts with him sharing a bed with his older brother, who really kicks him out of bed early in the morning. He goes off to his paper round, and he is a kid who seems to suffer physical abuse in every aspect of his life. So he's beaten up by his older brother, he's beaten up by kids in the schoolyard, he is handed out fairly severe corporal punishment by a teacher at school, and his life, because of that level of violence, is pretty miserable. So we recognise that in ourselves when we read the book. But there was something else remarkable about this novel that I felt a relationship to that in a way would have surprised me, and I think would surprise people even thinking about the inner city of Melbourne during that period. Now what I'd like to do is just read briefly a paragraph from this novel and then talk about its influence on me. And this is when Billy leaves the industrial centre of the city and first ventures to a place where he finds, of course, the kestrel, the bird that he comes to love. He ran back across the estate and straight down the avenue, slowly to a walk as he reached the cul-de-sac, round like a bulb of a thermometer. He cut down a snicket between two houses, out into the fields, leaving the estate behind him. The sun was up and the cloud band in the east had thinned to a line on the horizon, leaving the dome of the sky clear. The air was still and clean, and the trilling of the larks carried far over the fields of hay, which stretched away on both sides of the path. Great rashes of buttercups spread across the fields, and amongst the mingling shades of yellow and green, dog daisies showed their white faces contrasting with the rust of sorrel, all underscored by clovers white and pink and purple, which came into their own on the path sides where the grass was shorter, along with daisies and the ubiquitous plantations. Now, this is remarkable because what this is saying in this book is that this boy lives in this very grimy city centre, but he so quickly, so easily finds himself in nature, in a wilderness where he discovers this beautiful bird, the kestrel. Now, at the time that I was exposed to kestrel for a knave, I was living on a housing commission estate in Richmond in Elizabeth Street. So this is one of those classic concrete brutalist structures of the 1960s, and it was a fairly severe place to live. But we also had the beauty of nature being very close by us, in that we were literally a 5-minute walk from the Studley Park National Park and, of course, the mighty Yarra, or what we know as the Birrarung River. And when I read the book again, I understood that here was a boy who loved nature and came to love nature despite the fact of him living in a very grimy city. And I think what I want to say about this is that not only did I discover that commonality, it's probably the first time that I understood the universal qualities of writing. In other words, to consider that a book could be written about a fictional boy, again, on the other side of the world, that we in a high school in inner Melbourne could relate to. And that for me was an eye-opener as a reader, and it's something that became very influential later on for me as a writer, in the sense that I believe, and my writing I think attests to this, I believe that you can write very much about locality, you can write very much about your own place, and that writing itself will hold universal qualities that can be shared with readers, not only from different lifestyles, but from different parts of the world. So that, my first introduction being to the library, my second introduction to the world of literature, of course, being about the relationship between the reader and the writer, being an incredibly intimate relationship. The next part of my journey that I'd like to talk about and introduce you to, I suppose, is the discovery late in life for me, in a sense, the discovery of writing, of wanting to be a writer, of knowing that I could write. Now, I had actually done quite well at school in regard to English. So while my studies suffered greatly, as I talked about earlier, English was one of those subjects that I did well at. And clearly, I think because I had been such an avid reader throughout my childhood. After I left school, so that, as I said before, being expelled from school as a 15-year-old, I drifted around from job to job until at the age of 21, I was very fortunate to get a job as a firefighter in Melbourne in the fire brigade, where I worked for the next 8 or 9 years. Now, the reason why I'm sharing that experience is not to talk about firefighting, that the fact that that job offered me incredible opportunity to do an enormous amount of reading. So there's lots of downtime when you're in a job like that, in between those rushes of emergency work that you have to do. So I was a person who read probably 2 or 3 books a week, who read current affairs every day, who read the newspaper back to front every day, so that in that 8 or 9 years, my education, my learning through reading was very strong and very developed. So in my late 20s, so I was probably about 27 or 28, it's when I first started to realize that I had missed out on a great opportunity, and that was to stay at school as a younger person and to try and do well at school, and of course consider possibly tertiary education. I bit the bullet when I was 28 or 29 years of age, and I enrolled in what we call romantically night school. So I enrolled to do a HSC course at a TAFE college, Broadmeadows TAFE College, in the first year that it was in operation. And in 1987 I attended school 4 nights a week and did 4 HSC subjects throughout the year of 1987. What I want to talk about here, in the sense of discovering the joy of writing, is in relationship to, and if people know me, know this quite well, my addiction to running, which became my introduction to writing. So that after I joined the fire brigade, I was only about 21 or 22, I started to run marathons, to do a lot of training each week, and it became really a dedicated daily meditation and exercise that I embarked upon. And it was very important to me because it gave me a great sense of regularity in my life and evenness. It was very important to go running and to think, to reflect, to contemplate. And also, of course, because I'd had a wayward teenage years and early adulthood, it was a means of me deciding that there were 2 things that I could do in my 20s. One is that I could be a runner and reader, or 2 is I could be a heavy drinker. And I decided at that young age that I wasn't going to drink alcohol any longer, and I was going to, in fact, enjoy my life in other ways. So when I started at the TAFE College, and I hope this gives you the context here, is that on the first night of the English class, the teacher, a woman by the name of Anne Misson, who became one of my lifelong mentors, she talked about the subject of English, and she talked about it in relationship to writing and our ability to become writers and our interest in becoming writers. And it's not something that I'd contemplated, and certainly was not one of the reasons that I went to night school. And toward the end of the class, we had about 15, 20 minutes left of the class. She said to us, I would like each of you to write an A4 size reflection. I would like you to write about something in your life that you really enjoy and love, and I want you to hand those pages in before you leave the room, so I can just get a sense of where you're at with your writing and what interests you. So I sat there for about 5 minutes, I think, and then I realized the only thing that I could think of writing about at this moment is running, and how much I love running, and what running means to me, and what running does to me. And I wrote a 1-page essay, which was just a reflection on enjoyment of the process. I think I wrote a paragraph about the sense of the physical change when you run. And so once you warm up and your body starts to experience the joy of running, muscle memory, which I really believe in, of remembering a previous run and getting back to that. And then that beautiful euphoria of finishing a run at the end of a session. And I handed the sheet of paper in, and then the next week it wasn't mentioned until the end of the class, and she asked me, Anne Misson, to stay behind. And on the basis of 1 page of writing, she actually said to me, you can really write. I think you can really write. And that encouragement was probably the first time in my life that I could remember someone giving me such encouragement. I didn't think I'd become an overnight sensation by any means, but it was the first time that I thought about the possibility of doing more writing. Now, the second part of that story, I suppose, and how this is contextualised, is that at the end of 1987, Anne Misson said to me, "Are you going to apply for university entry?" Again, something which I had never considered in any way. And I said, "I don't think so." And she said, "I think you should. I think you would do very well at university." And then I said, "Where should I apply?" And she said, "Well, I think Melbourne University." Now, that to me was just something of a joke, to consider that I would find myself at the University of Melbourne studying. So I did put in the entry to university. I remember my first day of walking through the wrought iron gates at the University of Melbourne, and even though I had done very well, by the way, in my HSC exams the year before, as I walked through the gates of the university, I felt, one, that I was a fraud, and two, that I would get found out very quickly, that this year of success at night school had been an aberration, and once I was amongst the best and brightest, so-called, of Melbourne, I would be found out and found wanting. Now, that wasn't the case. I actually, again, did very well at university, and I know why I did well at university. It was because all of those years of reading, whether it be reading fiction, reading politics, reading current affairs, reading history, I in fact had done a lot of homework. I in fact had done a lot of self-education by being an avid reader that had put me in good stead to do well at university. So in other words, I was well prepared to enter into the humanities because I had been reading and thinking about the humanities for probably 15 years without knowing it. And the point here is relative. It's not just the non-fiction reading that I was doing, but understanding that fiction is so powerful, that fiction is such a wonderful genre, that when you read good fiction, the really major issues that give us a sense of the human condition and what it is to be a human and how we interact with each other is something we learn almost by osmosis, I think, when we're reading quality fiction. So the point I want to make here is that being at university, I felt that I had really done well because of how much I love words. And of course, this is what tonight's conversation is all about. It's about words. So that, again, is one of the other major pivotal moments in my development. I want to move on a little bit now and talk about something else, because I did say that I did well at university, so I ended up doing a PhD at the University of Melbourne, and in fact I taught at the University of Melbourne for many, many years, so that I began to teach history at the University of Melbourne in 1996, and I taught Aboriginal history and Australian history for 6 years. And then in 2002, I moved to what was then called the English department, where I taught in the creative writing program for 13 years, sometimes being head of program, but teaching subjects far and wide, such as short fiction, creative non-fiction, dabbling in a little bit of poetry, and I would say dabbling, but being someone who not only enjoyed writing, but began to enjoy teaching students to write. Now, the important point to note here is that while I was publishing myself, so I'd published some poetry, I'd published some short stories, I'd published academic work, academic writing, particularly in the discipline of history, I hadn't published a book at all. And it's important to note here that when I talk about our writing life, I in fact didn't publish my first book, Shadowboxing, until I was 49, until 2006, and I'll talk about that a little further in a moment. But the other thing that happened to me at university, as being a historian, I started to look into the history of the incarceration of Aboriginal people in Victoria in a series of reserves and missions. And this is a really important story to tell because it talks to the heart of the power of writing and it talks to the heart of this technology of the written word and how powerful it can be to people who you may not expect to avail themselves to this wonderful discipline. So a little but brief history lesson. Aboriginal people were first incarcerated on missions and reserves in Victoria around the period of 1860. So the so-called Board for the Protection of Aborigines is established in 1860, and Aboriginal people are very quickly forced to move on to a series of missions and reserves across the colony. Once people are placed on a reserve, it was often the case that children were separated from parents and family, and it was often the case that children were placed in something like a dormitory system. And the dormitory system was set up to encourage the students to learn reading, writing and arithmetic, to learn about the Bible, to learn about Christian tradition, and to learn to work very hard in the field for their masters. And the intention of the Victorian colonial government, and the intention, of course, of the Protectorate, was in fact to educate these children as they grew into young adulthood so that they could follow orders, so that they could count their wages, and so they understood what they had to do. So in other words, to create a young adult population of Aboriginal people who would defer but also would be disciplined and understand how discipline operated. What wasn't expected was that these young adults would in fact use English, written English, to their advantage. So a lot of kids that were taken into the reserves and mission systems in the 1860s, by around the period of the early 1880s, they are young adults, and they have learnt to read, they have learnt to write. And what they begin to do with this new technology is to write letters of protest to government, to write letters of demand for improved conditions on reserves. They write petitions to the Queen of England, Queen Victoria herself, and they use English, they use written words, they use language as a means of seeking self-determination, as a means of seeking land rights for their community, as a means of seeking human rights and social justice for themselves and their families. Now, the power of this technology is such that in 1884, a Reverend Bulmer, who in fact is the head of the Lake Tyers Aboriginal Reserve in today's Gippsland, he writes to the Chief Secretary of the Colonial Government in 1884 and says the greatest sin that we committed in coming to this country was to give the natives the power of the written word, because they have used it against us. And it's a remarkable admission that these people who were regarded as primitive, these people who are regarded as savage, take up this technology, they understand it in a very sophisticated and strategic way, and they use English to make demand for themselves. So this generation of young people who are adults in the early 1880s, they are, of course, the first generation of political activists in Victoria, and subsequently the similar actions to this we witness across Australia, which is through this introduced technology. So I learned so much from this experience about how we can use English not just for political means, but how we can use language, how we can use the written word to empower ourselves greatly. Now, the other research project that I undertook in relationship to this after this discovery was to consider the way that Aboriginal people, but most particularly Aboriginal women, began to use writing to make demand for themselves in the 20th century. And what I did here is that I went to the Public Records Office in North Melbourne, to the Australian Archives Office in the city, and I looked at the correspondence files, which were files of material that held letters written by Aboriginal people to the Protectorate and the responses that the Protectorate returned to those people. I want to read the briefest excerpt of one of these letters and just conclude this section with another little commentary. And this is called A Mother's Story. And this is a mother from the reserve at Framlingham in the Western District on Gunditjmara country. And this is a mother writing to her daughter, a daughter who has been illegally removed from her mother's care and taken to a reserve many miles away. The letter states, "Dearest darling daughter, I now write you these few lines, hoping it will find you in good health. You don't know how much I long for you. I am always thinking about you. Me and Auntie, also your poor little brothers, they are always saying to me, when is sister coming home again? All your brothers sends their love." Now, what I would like to say about this letter, and I suppose this genre of writing, is one, that is extremely powerful, and two, the power of these letters is such that the state acts against these women in relationship to this political agitation. So people, of course, would have heard about the story of the stolen generations. What people may not have heard about is the role that writing plays in this history. So, as I've just alluded to here, Aboriginal women across Australia wrote many, many thousands of words, many, many thousands of letters, hoping that their children would be returned to them. Those children also wrote letters back to their parents, seeking to come home to family. And what we know is that in many instances, the letters that parents sent never got to their children, and the letters that children sent back to their parents also never arrived. We know that letters were sometimes torn up and thrown in waste paper bins. We know that letters were sometimes burnt, and we also know tragically that letters were posted and received on reserves and missions, in fact, were not given to the child, but were placed in a filing cabinet. So when you go to the Public Records Office, not only will you find writing by Aboriginal women, in particular writing to their children, you will realise that those letters were never opened or never received by that child. And I would like people to think about this for a moment, because we're here as writers celebrating our common love of writing, our common love of reading. And this is such a tragic history, because what we know is that these women sat at kitchen tables under great threat and duress of their freedom. They sometimes wrote their letters to children on brown paper envelopes, scraps of paper, anything that they could find with a lead pencil sitting at a kitchen table. They wrote those letters very carefully, very, very eloquently, beautiful poetic letters, very heart-wrenching letters in many cases, but letters where they really gave everything of themselves, their emotional selves, wanting to convey to their children how deep their love for their children was and how desperately they wanted their children to return home. And then to consider that those letters never get opened, those letters never get read, those children never get to set their eyes on those words that their parents had put together with so much care. When I consider that, I think it's such a terrible outcome, not only for the women who wrote these letters, but the children who never saw them, and of course in some instances never saw their parents again. I also think about this in relationship to something which might seem self-indulgent, but it is one of the issues that I consider as a writer, is that we might think of all sorts of reasons that we write. Some of us may think we write for financial gain. There are very few of us who do that, I know. Some of us might write for fame, and I think that outcome is restricted to very few people also. And some of us write because of, I suppose, an egotistical drive. And I think we all have part of that, and I think that that can be very healthy or unhealthy, but ego, I think, is part of the brief of being a writer. I don't doubt that. But why I write essentially is to make sense of the world, so that whether I'm working with long fiction, a novel, or short fiction, poetry, or non-fiction, so I write occasional essays, my first introduction to a piece of writing, my first thought about putting pen to paper or putting words on a screen is, as for me, a means of making sense of the world that I'm a part of. The second issue there, of course, is that I'm doing this because I want to engage with someone. In other words, I want to be read. I want to be read because when I've put something down on paper, I do want a response. I want a relationship. I want an engagement with someone out there who will pick up a book, who will pick up an essay, who will look at an online journal and will reflect on those words and will make sense of them or criticise them because of their own response, their own relationship with the written word. Thinking about that and considering again this terrible outcome for these people who never got to read the letters written by parents, is that if someone ever asked me what's the worst aspect of being a writer, with me it's the thought that no one would read your work. No one would want to read your work. There are many other aspects of being a writer that you might think are more horrific. A bad review, which we all get from time to time. Missing out on a prize, which I've missed out on many, many times. Neither of those things worry me at all. The thought that my work doesn't impact on a person, that doesn't create some sense of traction or relationship with a person, or that the work lies unread, would for me be the worst outcome of being a writer, because to me that makes what I do in some ways meaningless. Of course, that's nothing like the experience of these women and their children who are not getting to read those emotional, loving words of family. But I think the notion that if we value words, if we value writing, we surely must value the fact that the relationship between a writer or the life of a writer only matters in relationship to the reader experience. Without readers, for me personally, we have nothing. Okay, so what I want to finish with is to reflect on my own writing just briefly. One of the things that I talked about earlier was the impact of the novel Kestrel for a Knave on my reading habit and my sense of making sense of the world. That the relationship I had with this book, this short paperback book, was such and so deeply profound that it has never left me, that thought of the intensity and the intimacy of my relationship with that novel. So this is my first book, Shadowboxing, and this is the first edition, which you can no longer get. And I want to read just again a very short excerpt from one of the stories in this collection, Sea of Tranquility, and I think it attests to the same sensibility that Billy Casper had as a teenage boy, and the same sense that this boy, Michael Byrne, has, which I will say quite openly, this is the most autobiographical of any of my works. And in this story, I hope that we get a sense of the same attraction a boy has for that place of nature, that place of country that we call country in the Aboriginal community, beyond the hard edges of the city. So this is the story Sea of Tranquility, which is a story about two boys and their misadventures around the period of the first moon landing, the Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969, hence the Sea of Tranquility, which is the spot on the moon where the Apollo 11 spaceship landed. Driving cars was for the night. During the days of that dry and warm summer, we rarely left the river. From the break-up of school in the week before Christmas and all throughout January, the heat did not let up. Most other kids from the housing estate hung out at the public swimming pool, but not me and Charlie. We spent all our time at one of the swimming holes skirting the river, from Richmond all the way through Collingwood and on into the east, the catwalk at Burnley, Skipping Girl at Abbotsford, or Collins Bridge, the convent and Deep Rock, all in Collingwood. There wasn't a day when the sun didn't bake our skin, working it from brick to brown, and we never saw so much as a single drop of rain. The river began to slowly lower in the heat as the sun soaked up an increasing amount of water. Quicksand-like mudflats soon appeared and spread along the edges of the riverbank from the catwalk all the way to points beyond. So this is about two boys and their love of the river and their love of the national park. And I have to say there was no intention when I wrote Shadowboxing to consciously go back to Kestrel for a Knave. And it's interesting that I hadn't read that book for many years when I wrote my first book, as I said, at the age of 49. But going back to reading Kes a few years ago, there isn't a commonality of direct storyline in much of the collection of mine with Kes, but it's remarkable how attuned my book is to that reading experience. So there are aspects of my book around male violence, around a boy who is confused about his status as a teenage boy, who will become a man, and how does he exist in this brutal world when he sees this beauty of the bird, of the kestrel. He sees the beauty of nature around him, and he understands without having the articulation, without having the sophisticated language to attest to it, that this is something beautiful, this is something different, this is something better than what he has. And in my first book, Shadowboxing, similarly, Michael Byrne, who we follow from early childhood into adulthood, he understands as a boy that the world that he exists in, this brutal world of the inner city that he exists in, is not a world that he wants for himself, but he doesn't know how to escape that world. He doesn't even know how to voice his own feelings, except he knows they are there, they inhabit his body. So when I think about the influence of Kestrel for a Knave on my writing, I can only say, as people often suggest, that all writers, we have our heroes, we have our influences, and this book to me is the foundation stone of my life as a writer. So what I would like to say to people in closing, and I don't think anything that I would say here would be remarkably new to anyone, but it's to attest, as I'm sure we all attest as writers and readers, how important it is when you have the journey of writing that you continue your journey of being a reader. I had the great joy of walking up to Readings Bookshop in Carlton in 2006 and seeing Shadowboxing in the window. It was a very emotional experience for several reasons. One is because I love Readings Bookshop, particularly the Carlton shop where I'd spent many, many years, and I still go into that shop at least once a week as a reader. To see my book in the window of a bookshop I love was really deeply emotional. The second issue was the fact that I had a book that was in a bookshop window was surreal. I really couldn't make sense of it. And the third aspect of that was to take my mother up to Readings Bookshop and take her photograph in front of the bookshop, not only because she was so proud of what I had achieved, but she was equally puzzled as to, in a sense, how did this happen? Not disbelieving in me and not doubting me, but where we came from, our life didn't give us the choice of, we would never consider the choice of being a writer. So that since that first book, I've published, I think, 8 books. I have 2 new books coming out in 2021, and I have found that my insatiable desire to be a writer hasn't diminished. I'm always driven to wanting to do more writing, but again, to do more writing to engage with readers. The 3 aspects of my life, to close, that are so important to me outside family, so family is primarily for me the most important aspect of my life, are running, reading, and writing. They're the 3 things that I have done every day of my life for the last more than 40 years. There wouldn't be a day go by that I haven't done that, except possibly with running when I've been injured or just completely buggered and worn out. Someone asked me once if I had to give up reading, running, or writing, which would it be? And it might surprise you, but it would be writing. As much as I love writing, reading has been my lifelong joy, and to not read would be something I couldn't even countenance. And my running is something that I can't live without. And if I don't run, I don't write anyway. So it's running, in fact, keeps me balanced, keeps my life even, and what has allowed me to be a writer. And I would just say, finally, in conclusion, that to be a writer is such a wonderful, wonderful experience. And I always feel very blessed to have published my work. I feel very lucky to have published my work. And most of all, I feel so fortunate to have engaged and had relationships with many, many readers. So thank you very much.